ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today, and thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you to everybody who took the time to meet with me yesterday as well, and to give me more insight into the Cyprus problem. I really appreciate that. Today, I just want to talk to you about our experience in Northern Ireland. For those of you who are not fully aware, Northern Ireland is the north of the island of Ireland. It's a UK region, and we had 30 years of conflict there, violent conflict between two religions, both Christian but Catholic and Protestant, and that affected Northern Ireland, and it also affected the bordering region of Ireland, because it sat across the border and suffered the way certain areas in Northern Ireland did. We now have 30 years of peace since the peace accord. And as has been mentioned, I think, by nearly everybody this morning already, we work at that peace every single day. Okay? So this is just a timeline to give you a little bit of an understanding of the EU Peace Programme. Is a programme that came into force before the peace accord. 4 years before the peace accord, there was a ceasefire, and the EU wanted to make a positive contribution to that ceasefire. And they, along with the UK government, the Irish government and the Northern Ireland Executive, they all contributed to a programme which was known as Peace 1. Now you can see there a timeline that shows the iterations of the peace programme, and I'll explain those in a minute. But you can see that they run from 94 to 95, the programme started, right up until today, where we're now delivering the Peace Plus programme. The Good Friday Agreement happened in 98, so the peace programme was well underway, and at that point in time, the Special EU Programmes Body was established as part of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, a Belfast Agreement, which was the peace accord and established cross-border institutions. So we're jointly governed by both governments on the island. And you can see as well that the peace programme runs parallel to the political process. It's never to be confused with the political process. It's a practical process on the ground. But if you look in red at all of the areas below, that was the time where our government in Northern Ireland was under suspension. So they weren't sitting. So we had no government. And all of those times, so there's been, falters along the way from the peace accord. But throughout all of that, and at a political level, the peace programme kept on delivering. So that's a very important point that I'd like to make, is that peace building for us began long before the peace accord. And I do believe that had it not been for that practical peace programme on the ground, we may not have had the same result when it came to the peace accord, because the programme allowed people to actually see what peace could look like, what hope could look like, what opportunities there were there with peace, how we could develop economically, socially. And it filled that space between the violence and the peace accord. But it is very much, as I said, a parallel process. And it began, I think it was very cleverly crafted, in that it began by not looking back. It didn't at that point look back to what had happened, because at that stage it was too difficult to do that. And instead it looked at the significant deprivation socially and economically. And any attempt to build inclusion had to start with the capacity for a productive and profitable economy. And that's how it began. So activities may have included rebuilding infrastructure, business support, skills development, and particularly in the area of women and childcare development and young youth, their childhood development. Okay. So the evolution of the programmes, as I said, you saw the timeline they ran, and they kept being replaced as the iterations of programmes in the EU periods replaced them. We began with the first programme, which was at the time, as I said, before the peace accord, and very much focused on that economic delivery. We then moved into Peace 2. Again, that was focusing on the legacy of the conflict and they promoted reconciliation, and we responded to the social and economic difficulties, and we tried to build trust and empower communities. And at that point we realised that the word reconciliation meant so many different things to different people, and at times could be difficult. So throughout Piece 2 to Piece 3 we commissioned a piece of work which actually looked at the definition of reconciliation, and we used that then as the criteria for helping to focus projects on what they had to do. Each project had to think how they were actually helping the other community, how they were taking the opportunities that arose from peace and addressing the legacy of the conflict. And then as we shaped the programme, we moved into Piece 4, which aimed to look specifically at lasting changes and boost collaboration and enhance cross-border cooperation, addressing the legacy of the past. And all along the side of the programme, the Peace programme, also ran the Interreg programme, because we do have a hard border on our island. So we had an Interreg programme between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and indeed Western Scotland came in there as well in the latter years. But that was a very important project too, because it helped address cross-border challenges. And so what we like to refer to as the peeling, what I've referred to as the peeling of the onion, because we began with areas that appeared simple, appeared straightforward. Now looking back, people coming into a room and sitting down and talking and having a cup of coffee and getting to know one another. Now, when you look back at that, they might say that seems very easy, but you know yourself that is not easy, not when you have two communities that are so opposed diametrically. So we looked at the immediate positive impact that could be made, as I said with Piece 1, moved into specific areas and sectors, and we looked then in Piece 2 to those most marginalised from the community. We looked at issues of segregation then in Piece 4, and we focused then a lot on infrastructure and rebuilding infrastructure on what would be known as flashpoints. And those that were most affected by the conflict we tried to address the sectarianism and the prejudice that had been gained. It's unfortunate that the areas that were most affected by the conflict and suffered most during the violence and were the most deprived still are, unfortunately, 30 years later, the most deprived areas. And those are the ones that we try to really reach into the heart now. So Peace Plus sits at the heart at the minute. And I hope we're starting to look at Peace Plus 2 and it'll go further, because the 30 years has enabled that time to actually delve into issues, to be able to get it adapted to the economy, it adapted to the environment, it adapted to conditions, and it allows us to go deeper. It now allows us to try to engage with people who really have never wanted to engage in peace building before or cross-community work. And that does require single communal work before they can go to bi-communal work. That is an absolute fact. But it's really important that you understand we have been working at this for 30 years. And Northern Ireland is not a closed case. We have learned a lot. We have learned what we should do, what we shouldn't do, what worked, what didn't work. We have insights. The theory, the research on trauma and intergenerational trauma has come more to the fore in the last few years. But we are not a case closed. We are an evolving, living system which is now sustaining peace. And that is, as everybody mentioned this morning, a key to this is about protecting and sustaining peace. We did define reconciliation, and that's one of the things that we've learned how important language is, because there's no ready-made definition of reconciliation that fits every conflict zone or every circumstance, especially for deeply divided communities. So instead we provided investment in areas that the mainstream government couldn't do. We were able to go in and really get into the hearts of communities. But at its most basic, what we came up with this definition of reconciliation was that, it developed a shared vision for an independent and fair society. And you've heard all that language already this morning. Building positive relationships and significant culture and attitudinal change. Substantial social, economic and political change. And of course you have to acknowledge and deal with the past. But that is how we established our definition of reconciliation. And as I said, each project then had to look at how they were contributing to that. And language, we have now moved away a little bit from using that term, reconciliation, because it's a very emotive term to people and a challenging term and can be, very sensitive. So instead we would look at words such as healing and empathy, understanding, peace of mind, peace of heart. But we try to stay away a little bit from the word reconciliation because it means too many things to too many different people. What we have learnt is that there is a very eminent psychiatrist, Dr. Eugene Coe, who began his work on looking at the Indigenous and Aboriginal tribes. And he has compared a lot of the work he did with Northern Ireland, and we can see it in our daily experiences of how, as a society, we have suffered from collective trauma. And as a society, you will also have suffered from collective trauma because everybody has gone through the same experience. They don't experience it the same way, but they have been through that experience of what has happened here. And peace building is not just about infrastructure and economic repair. You have to rebuild people. You have to rebuild their minds. You have to rebuild their thoughts, their memories, and how they move forward in life. And trauma is not trauma, as some people may think. It's not about PTSD or an injury or witnessing a violent act. It's about a wound. And in our case, most of us would actually carry a wound in the mind, not physically on the body, but in the mind. Because if we assume an experience is beyond that of an individual, it becomes collective. And collective is also a cultural trauma because it's a shared experience of identity, ethnicity, or culture. And it's known then as cultural trauma. And it's timeless. And the traumatic wound is not bound by time. It feels very real when it becomes re-triggered. And anybody who has suffered great grief will know that if they at any time go back to think about the time when they lost their loved one, that grief comes back instantly. And that's what trauma is. And that's what trauma is in this situation as well. So people become emotionally disassociated. They start to try to numb, or what we have discovered in Northern Ireland a lot is we use silence. Nobody talks about it. If we don't talk about it, it didn't happen. But it did. And that gets passed down through generations. And as we said, the mind can be triggered with, we still have in Northern Ireland our political commemorations, and every time that something happens like that, people get triggered again by being effectively re-exposed to the trauma. And the worst part about the trauma is that if it's not dealt with, and we didn't know 30 years ago to start dealing with this. We only know now to start dealing with this in the last maybe 8 to 10 years. The research has really come to the fore on this. And that's why we can only talk about our experience, and anything resonates with you, I hope it does. But this is what we've discovered, that, a traumatized society also will become very polarized in their thoughts. They become very polarised in who they follow and their leaders. And silence then, as I said, can detach people completely emotionally from what's happened. And if it's not dealt with, and if you don't actually look at these things, and our programme does go in and try to deal with some of these issues, and sometimes it's as simple as storytelling, art, music, culture, all of those things that can actually go in and break that trauma cycle. And the problem is that if you don't break that trauma cycle, the mind falls back to where you were. And if people end up retreating into very polarised positions, they even become unable to think about what is politically correct, and they go to the loudest voice, or they stay silent in the middle, and the middle ground then sits there, and the two most extreme parties are those that will actually lead the way in thinking. And you may think, well, that's all very well, our troubles stopped 30 years ago, and we haven't suffered great violence since then, thank God. But the impact of that carries on today in terms of intergenerational trauma, because the culture and the legacy of the conflict gets passed on to the young people of today, and it gets passed on in an awful lot of different ways. It can be passed through the genes. It can be passed through the silence in the house on certain subjects, and a child knows that they're not being spoken about. You've seen it all around the world already in areas of conflict. It can get passed on in the parents being traumatised themselves and not being able to parent properly, and the child then goes on and lives a life without being fully supported as a family life. We've noticed a lot in our society, unfortunately, hypersensitivity to shame and humiliation, agitation, anxiety, flashbacks, highly reactive, and a sense of being stuck and paralysis. All of this can come into the fore in a family life, and then that gets passed on to the children. It's unconsciously projected in a lot of cases, but as a child at the age of 4 understands where it comes from, what community it belongs to, and by the age of 6, those prejudices are ingrained. And one of our most important projects, and it's one of our smaller projects, was actually about going around teaching parents how not to ingrain prejudice of any kind in their children, just to be careful, because we've all done it. We've all said something that we shouldn't have said in front of our children, even if it's just in the car, when somebody, cuts you up and you go, oh, we've all done it. So it's about actually putting in the tools not to do that. So, groups with high levels of trauma will also end up scapegoating groups. So you find sometimes they'll talk about the youth and how terrible they are, what they're doing, and it's nothing to do with them at all. It's just they're looking for an outlet for their scapegoating. And the conflict continues, as I said, to damage lives in Northern Ireland. And I'm not saying this in a negative way, but it's true. And the programme is there to support it. The EU programme has been there supporting our work in making sure that our children deserve better. And so we are looking at trauma-informed responses in services and conflict-sensitive interventions. We still have paramilitary violence in our society. Now, a lot of that can be actually put down to criminality and drug running, but it's dressed up with a flag. And then young people in a society who have nobody else to look for, especially if they've come from a house that isn't able to fully parent them, they then end up following those flags. Those people that seem to be respected in the community. Those children are very vulnerable to getting involved in antisocial behaviour, and that's where they end up being coerced to be involved in drug running. And the young people today, just was a very robust study carried out last year and demonstrated that 28 years after the Belfast Agreement, 60% of the adult population in Northern Ireland reports at least one adverse childhood experience, with nearly 1 in 5 experiencing 4 or more incidents. And when you pass 4 adverse child experiences, that has significant life-limiting opportunities for that adult. We unfortunately have a high degree of drug use. We have the highest level of antidepressant drugs in the whole of the world. We have high levels of young male suicide. We have extreme use of drugs and alcohol. And a lot of that is to do with, as I said, the past and how that's been passed forward, but also now witnessing violent endeavours currently with the paramilitary groups. And you can see that since the Good Friday Agreement, 87 children under the age of 18 have been shot by paramilitaries, not killed, but shot. And the youngest of those was 10 years of age. So that intergenerational approach is extremely important, and particularly through family-centred support services. So the Peace Programme is addressing those challenges. We're working to overcome those, but we have met many challenges along the way. COVID pushed community relations back 10 years because people went back into their communities. We had Brexit, we won't talk about that, but that was a significant cultural trauma at the time as well. We are looking to try to get into the hard-to-reach groups, those that really need to get involved, those that really want an opportunity as well, and try to change their minds from what they're doing to actually a more productive element in society. We need to create that space for all cultures and identities. to remove those high-profile tensions, to show respect for all cultures. And we have, as I said, high health inequalities, and particularly around our border area, where it is in rural areas. So we would have established like cross-border health services, because it's so important for every citizen to understand that they have equality of opportunity. They have the same opportunity as somebody of another community. That is a really significant element for people's well-being and mental health well-being. We still have our economic challenges, and of course we have our environmental challenges. So what we've developed with the Peace Plus programme, we took a little bit of the Interreg programme and the Peace programme that we used in the past, and we believe now we have a complete ecosystem approach to peace building. You cannot focus on one area, as I said. You can't just focus on infrastructure. You can build a hospital, but unless people have the mindset to go jointly to that hospital, it'll sit empty. So we have actually looked at how can we look at peace building that covers all areas. And we offer a rare longitudinal example of an adaptive ecosystem for peace building in action today and will continue. And it is that adaptive approach to developing programmes which is very positive. We have built throughout the programme, there has been 23,000 projects funded, all different sizes and levels. Interestingly, 14,000 of those 23,000 projects were before the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that's really important. You have to prepare. But throughout all of that 23,000 projects, we have built a lattice of peace building in the communities. The people who are in there, champions in their own communities, changing attitudes, just getting simple things, people to meet. And it's a very adaptive approach to developing the programmes. And that durable peace depends on a wider ecosystem of networked and interconnected peace building of activity. So we actually then developed it on the basis of, this is known as the donut model of economics. It's an Oxford model. And I'm sorry that if you ignore this blue background, the model is much clearer. The way we looked at it is that when we were developing the programme, everybody should, it's a bit like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, everybody in society should be able to be on that blue centre circle. That's the donut. And so you look at all of the areas here, like energy, jobs, labour, equality, justice, and we looked at a socio-economic study of our region and how, where the strengths were, where the weaknesses were, where we saw there should be improvement, where there should be investment. And that was how we shaped the programme, that we will put more in here and we'll put a little bit more in there to try to bring everybody in society onto that blue donut, the peaceful and prosperous society, inclusive and sustainable economic development. But all of that has to be done in the context of the environment and climate. So you can't do anything that's going to harm the climate. And so, you had to focus on where we needed investment as well. We invest in water projects and infrastructure projects within the programme. So how we develop the content of the programme is also important, because we moved away from participation by citizens in programmes to actually the citizens helping co-design those programmes. And we established, if you look, we call this the Venn diagram of content design. So we took from the EU objectives, obviously, first, because they are our funders. And then we also looked at the programmes for government for Ireland, for the UK, for Northern Ireland. We did the socio-economic study of the region to look at our strengths and weaknesses. We looked at research reports in certain areas to show strengths or, again, weaknesses of areas of possible investment. We also went to all the chambers, the councils, the statutory agencies, those big charities, the NGOs, and we asked them for consultations, and we received almost 500 written consultations. We then said, well, that's okay, we've done that at that level. Now what about the people? What are they telling us they need? So we went out on the ground to every single council area, of which there are 12, and we met with 1,000 citizens. And sometimes the citizens just came along and they said, it's a room like this, and they would say, well, I'm not quite sure what we're here for, but we saw an advert, so we thought we'll come along. And they came in and then they gave us their views. And so we ended up with a programme that focuses on Building peaceful and thriving communities, and within that there's infrastructure projects. We've built bridges, we've built buildings in communities where the communities decided what they wanted and how they were going to be established. We then have a full area on socioeconomic regeneration and transformation, which includes research and skills development, empowering and investing in our young people. We believe that young people are not our future, our young people are right now. They will help every day shape how we move forward, what the approach is going to be, and what our future is going to look like. So anybody that thinks our young people are our future are very wrong. Theme 4 is about healthy and inclusive communities, and that was what I mentioned about the rural communities and how we brought in cross-border healthcare services and access, because if somebody's sitting away out on the side of our border, they're maybe 100 miles from a hospital on one side of the border, they might be 10 miles from, or kilometres, on the other side. So we've gone through a process of establishing how they can access those services. We've done a lot within there as well on victims and survivors, intergenerational trauma, mental health services for young people and others. We also have an environmental aspect to the whole programme, a transport link, which is a train that runs between the two capitals. And people may wonder, what's transport got to do with peace? But a lot, because it allows cross-border mobility. It allows citizens to go up and down the full island for job, for labour, for homes, for visiting, for social life. So it really contributes, as well as being environmentally important, it really contributes to the peace building in society. And the last one is about building and embedding partnership. So that's looking at addressing the legal and administrative challenges of a border. We have that hard border. And just, I think nearly finally, I'm looking at how important it was for us to have the EU involved in these programmes. The EU was seen as an honest broker. They were seen as a neutral source of money, because back particularly in Peace 1, if anybody had known from either community that there was Irish money or British money in the fund, they may not have taken it because we're stubborn, but they thought it was EU money because it was badged as an EU programme. And so they were, oh, we'll have some of that then. We're all EU citizens at that stage. We're not now, but so it meant that people actually got involved with the programme. The EU brought a lot of structures to our systems that we didn't have before. So we had, for the first time, government administrations dealing directly with the community and voluntary sector. That had never happened. So they learned a lot from that, but also the community and voluntary sector increased their governance, increased their own capacity, which was important because they weren't used to ever dealing with large sums of money in the past. We didn't have the institutions like myself, cross-border institutions at the time of Peace 1, so the money was administered through NGOs and charities that in their areas. So it might have been somebody who's involved with youth, or somebody who's involved with skills, or somebody who was involved with the women and training, or the childhood development, or the SME, the business sector. It allowed us to focus on partnership principle. It meant that everybody had a seat at the table. So you had, everything we do is cross-border, so it has to have representation from both sides of the border, and also representation from all sectors involved. So whether that's the two health specialists, the two equality specialists, the two trade unions, on either side we have two of everything, and that's important. And because they bring different perspectives as well. We focused on inclusion, and that again was a direction from the Commission at the time, looking at how we would address those most vulnerable in society. And the involvement of civic society was really important, so I'm delighted that you have also agreed to that, because the civic society really do play a big part in our programmes and how they're delivered. But the EU brought a discipline that we didn't have before. Because the money was administered, of course the political parties had to agree to the programme that we developed, but once they agreed to it, we got on with the work. And when, as I said, when the political institutions broke down, we were still able to deliver the peace programme, and it had a political representation on the programme committees as well, at a local level, with councillors. So I believe, this is my shout out to the Commission, a peace programme of activity is actually your best line of defence. And there's a big push now for defence spending in the European Commission, but I believe the peace programme is actually one way you can defend our long and hard fought for and won peace, and it's important that we preserve it. And whilst every peace building context is unique, there's many elements that are similar, and that's why we feel empowered to go and share our insights, because we know how privileged we've been to have had that programme for all of this time, which has protected the peace on the ground. And we never forget that. We never forget about how important it is to preserve the peace every single day. And so what I would say to you is I wish you all the very best with the negotiations. And it's wonderful to see there's a positive approach at the minute. But please be aware, patience is the most important thing, because we're still doing this 30 years after our peace accord, and we will carry on doing it. And I will come back next year and I will tell you new lessons that we've learned. So we're still learning, and I've learned a lot from you actually in the last couple of days as well. So thank you very much. Thank you.